My grandmother looked like that until the day of her death, because this was made in 1937 and she died in 1946. She was a beautiful young girl. As a matter of fact, I have a picture of her when she was a young girl. Her hair was always very gray, and she inclined to be a bit heavy, but she was a very lovely young girl. This is my grandmother, Nancy Ann Kirk Eagle. As a teenager, this is a daguerreotype. You know what a daguerreotype is?
I know it was preceded ordinary photography.
Right. And although her age is unknown, it is before she was married. And she was married at about 18, 19, and that was before she was married. I got this picture at the sale. The family pictures and everything were sold at the sale just like other items. And so this is a purchase I made at the sale. And I have no idea what I paid for it, but it wasn't much. Mm-hmm. Strange some of her children wouldn't have won it, wasn't it?
It really is.
My wife got
around $2 you paid for it. I remember you bidding it off.
Well, let's pull out this newspaper.
Okay.
Let's hear the story behind this.
Well, the biggest problem that my grandmother and grandfather ever had was of a religious nature. They were both Methodists there in the local church near the house. And about midlife, or a little later, he was influenced by the Pentecostal holiness group a few miles away towards Gold Hill. And so he left the Methodist church and joined the Pentecostal holiness. And my grandmother, this vexed her no end, and she was never happy with it, and it created a tension in their marriage which was never resolved. He eventually came back to the Methodist church, but it was late in life, and they spent some unhappy years about it. So the main theological difference between them was that my grandfather said that you had to have a second blessing. You were converted, and then you had to have a second blessing before you were really saved. My grandmother thought, according to her Methodist tradition, that if you were converted, that was sufficient. And it bothered him that she had never had the second blessing, so to speak. And it bothered her that he thought you had to have a second blessing. And so this was an argument, a running argument between them. But my grandmother used to joke about it and say that she had not only had a second blessing, she'd had a third and fourth and fifth and ever so many blessings, that her blessings didn't stop at 2. But it was just a theological argument between them, which caused a division in the home.
This Eli was the one that used to pray in the fields aloud.
No, that was his brother. His brother Will owned a field about an eighth of a mile from the house, just over down the road a bit, and he would kneel in the field and pray. We always felt he was praying to the neighborhood rather than to God, because he did it so loudly that we could hear it all the way to our house. And he would sing and pray. He would kneel by his plow. He'd stop his team and kneel down by the plow and hold the plow handles, and then he would really shout to the Lord or shout to the neighbors, whichever you wanted to say. Well, my grandfather he was always a bit of a religious fanatic, in that his religious opinions and all were very strong and a great part of his life, and yet very warped in some respects. A very stern person, and righteously stern. And he went to a lot of the church meetings. And this was when he was still in the Methodist church. And he was in High Point at a spiritual life conference held by the Methodist church. This is Eli, my mother's father, Eli. And he was at the conference in High Point. And he had a son living in High Point too. And he became rather boisterous in the meeting, and was picked up by the police because he was arousing a lot of commotion and so forth. It came out of his religious fervor, but it was taking rather strange turns. And so the police picked him up, and they do not identify him in the article, but this unidentified man was my grandfather.
What is this?
That is my grandmother Eagle's sugar bowl.
Now, when did you get that? When did
I got it when my grandmother died in 1946. She died, and they had a sale of her personal belongings. And I saw this. It had been on my grandmother's table, and behind her table, she had an old log kitchen, and the logs were great big heavy logs, but they had a space between the logs, and they had made racks for dishes between the logs. And this sugar bowl sat between the logs, back of her table there. And I'd seen it all my life when I'd eat at my grandmother's table. So when I saw this at her sale, that was a thing I immediately decided I must have. And a cousin of mine also had her eyes on it too, and she wanted it too. And so we hadn't talked to each other about it though, and this cousin was my chum when we were children. And so we started bidding against each other. And having not discussed it with her, I didn't know really, how important it was to her to have it. Mm-hmm. We bid along a little bit, and she stopped. And I got the sugar bowl, but she told me afterwards, several years afterwards, she says, I didn't bid any further, not that I wasn't willing to pay, but because I saw you wanted it so badly. Mm-hmm. So she let me bid the sugar bowl off. I think I paid about $2.30 for it, something like that. And I've had it ever since. The sale was in 1946.
Now I can remember this being around the house here when I was a kid, but I can't remember did we ever actually use it in anything?
No.
It was sitting up as a
Once
decoration.
in a long time I'd put candy or something in it, but I'd sit it high. Most of the time I did not even put anything in it for fear it would tempt you folks to want to use it. No, I never used it because I was afraid it would get broken.
Sure.
So it is still in perfect shape.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know how far back it dates, except that my grandmother had it all her married life, as far as I know.
I mean, to me, it's a very familiar visual image, but I can't remember
because
where.
You saw it here.
Would have been sitting up high in the
you
kitchen
were only
somewhere.
3 years old when I got it, you see. I got it in 46, and you were born in 43. So it's been in my possession that long, since 1946. And it's been sitting in my kitchen ever since, unless it was briefly carried off to another room for something. So that's my grandmother Eagle.
And here's your rolling pin.